The first blow of the sledgehammer echoed through the Holloway house like a warning the workers never heard. Dust rose in slow-moving clouds, coating the amber light that slipped through the boarded windows. It was October of 1984, and the old Victorian on Briar Road stood lifeless, a monument to a family that had once ruled Lancaster, Ohio, with charm, wealth, and a carefully cultivated silence. The remodeling crew had been hired to open up the space, though none of them expected the phrase to become literal. When the foreman, Rick Larson, struck the northeast wall of the upstairs hall, the sound changed. No longer the dull thud of plaster and lath, but a hollow drumbeat, almost metallic. The men paused. They exchanged wary glances before Rick swung again. The wall fractured. A crack widened like a grin. Behind it was darkness, still and cold. As they peeled away the boards, the space revealed itself. A hidden room no larger than a pantry, perfectly preserved, as if time had stopped the moment someone sealed it shut. A thin film of dust shimmered on every surface, yet nothing inside seemed disturbed. A small oak desk sat beneath a shuttered window that had never been meant to open. A wool coat, dark, tailored, unmistakably expensive, hung on a hook. And there, on the desk, lay a leather-bound journal with a brass clasp. The name on the coat's interior tag made one of the workers curse aloud: Edward Holloway. Rick only knew the name from local whispers, half-truths repeated in barbershops and diners, stories about a rich young man who had disappeared in 1954. Some said he'd run off to Chicago. Others insisted he'd drowned in the Hocking River. A few, mostly older black residents who had worked as servants for the Holloway family, spoke of something uglier, something that had happened inside the house itself. But the official record remained empty, the case unresolved, the Holloway name smudged but never stained by law. Now, a private room, sealed for 3 decades, was offering its first breath. Rick stepped inside, careful, reverent almost. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and something older, like ink left too long in the sun. Behind the desk, he found a photograph. A woman, not one he recognized. She had the kind of beauty that seemed uninvited. Heavy-lidded eyes, a subtle defiance in her posture. On the back of the photo, written in looping fountain pen script, "You said the night would change everything." Rick felt a chill crawl up the side of his neck. Before he could examine the journal, a tremor ran through the house. Just the settling of old beams, he told himself. But the sound had a curious rhythm, almost like a footstep pacing somewhere below. He left the room to call the property owner, a distant Holloway relative who had purchased the estate to renovate and sell. As he waited for the line to connect, his eyes drifted down the hallway, where the shadows seemed to gather unnaturally thick. The house had been empty since the late 60s, abandoned gradually as scandals and debts swallowed the once proud family. Yet Rick couldn't shake the feeling that something in the walls still listened. When the owner finally arrived hours later, she stood pale and rigid as she examined the discovery. Her name was Margaret Holloway, granddaughter of Edward's older brother. She had grown up with 2 truths: that the Holloways had once been powerful, and that they had never recovered from one summer night in 1954. Margaret touched the journal like it might burn her. She wouldn't open it. Instead, she asked Rick to gather the crew and leave the room exactly as they found it. But Rick had already noticed something else, something he chose not to mention: the coat hanging on the hook. Its hem brushed the floorboards, stirring faint dust. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible, yet it suggested one impossible detail. It had not been hanging there very long, and as he turned off the light, the shutter of the sealed window shifted ever so slightly, as though catching a draft from a room that had no air at all. Somewhere deep in the house, a soft tap sounded, delicate, deliberate, like a knuckle against wood. In the days after the discovery, the Holloway house seemed to exhale secrets. Margaret returned with a local historian, while Rick and his crew were told to halt all demolition until further notice. The hidden room remained untouched, a shrine to a young man who had vanished without leaving so much as a footprint on the world beyond Lancaster. Yet the more Margaret stared at the objects preserved within it, the more she sensed the outline of a story her family had worked hard to bury. The historian, Dr. Lane Weller, was an aging man with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He had lived through the Holloway scandal as a teenager and wore the memory of it like a badge no one else wanted to claim. When Margaret escorted him into the secret room, he paused on the threshold, his face tightening. "It's smaller than I imagined," he murmured. "But then again, Edward never needed much space to cause trouble." Margaret flinched. "My grandfather said Edward was misunderstood." Weller gave a slow, humorless smile. "Oh, he was misunderstood. Mostly because no one could agree on what kind of man he truly was." He brushed his fingers across the desk, producing a faint streak through the dust. The photograph of the mysterious woman caught his attention, and he examined it carefully, turning it beneath the dim light. A shadow of recognition passed over his expression. "She worked at the house, didn't she?" Margaret asked. Weller hesitated, then nodded. Her name was Lila Maynard. She was a maid, smart, quick, and far too bold for her own good. The town didn't like bold women back then, especially those who worked for families like the Holloways. Margaret watched him, her pulse climbing. "And she knew Edward?" "Oh, she knew him," Weller said. "Better than she should have. Better than was safe." He didn't elaborate, but the silence carried the weight of everything left unsaid, of glances exchanged in hallways, of doors quietly locked, of a love that wasn't supposed to exist. While Weller continued his examination, Margaret stepped back into the hallway, letting her mind drift to the stories she'd overheard as a child. The Holloways had enjoyed a veneer of respectability, but beneath it simmered tensions more complex than outward appearances suggested. Her great-grandfather, Charles Holloway, had been a man obsessed with social image, a man who believed in bloodlines, legacies, and purity of reputation. Edward, the middle son, had never fit the mold. He was erratic, brilliant, tender when he wanted to be, and drawn to people he was not allowed to love. The deeper Weller probed, the more Margaret feared that Edward's disappearance had little to do with running away, and everything to do with the family that claimed to love him. After an hour, Weller asked to see the rest of the house. The crew had cleaned up most of the debris from the initial demolition, leaving the hallways in an uneasy stillness. As they descended the sweeping staircase, Weller ran his hand along the polished banister. "This house heard arguments," he said, more than anyone ever admitted. "What kind of arguments?" she asked. "The kind that start as whispers and end in violence." His gaze drifted toward the back of the house, the servant wing. Margaret's breath caught. She had avoided that corridor, not out of fear, but out of something closer to inherited guilt. They walked through narrow hallways, past doors that hadn't been opened in decades. Weller paused outside one particular room. "This belonged to Lila," he said quietly. Margaret nudged the door open. Inside, dust floated in suspended patterns like snow trapped in a forgotten world. The walls were bare except for a single nail where a picture frame once hung. The absence felt louder than presence. Weller stepped inside and inhaled sharply. There were rumors, he said, not just of affection, of something that bound Edward and Lila together, something the family found unacceptable. Margaret felt her stomach twist. "Unacceptable how?" "Unacceptable enough," Weller replied, "that the night Edward disappeared, Lila disappeared too." The revelation clung to the air like smoke. Margaret felt the floor tilt under her. "But she was never mentioned," Margaret whispered. "Of course not," Weller said. "The Holloways didn't lose a servant. They lost a son, and a scandal." He turned toward her slowly. "And scandals must be buried, Miss Holloway. Preferably in rooms no one expects to find." Before Margaret could respond, a faint creak echoed from upstairs, a floorboard shifting under weight. Not the wind, not the house settling. A step, another, coming from the direction of the hidden room. The sound drifted down the staircase like a memory, soft, deliberate, unmistakably human. Margaret froze, her breath catching in her throat. Dr. Weller lifted his head, eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "That wasn't the house settling," he murmured. They exchanged a look, half disbelief, half dread, before Margaret forced her feet to move. She climbed the staircase, each step groaning beneath her weight, each shadow seeming to peel forward as though listening. When she reached the upper landing, the hallway stretched before her in a muted haze of dust motes and half-light. The hidden room's door stood exactly as she had left it, closed, perfectly still. But the air felt different, stirred, as if something had passed through. Margaret hesitated at the threshold, willing herself to touch the doorknob. When she did, the cold shocked her skin. She pulled back instinctively. Weller arrived behind her, breathing harder than he wanted to show. "Open it," he said. She pushed the door inward. The room appeared unchanged, but not untouched. The photograph of Lila, once positioned neatly at the center of the desk, now sat angled toward the chair, as though someone had been looking at it. The coat on the hook swayed, lightly this time, as if disturbed only seconds before. Margaret's instinct was to step inside, but Weller blocked her with a firm hand. "Don't," he said. "We need to think." "What is there to think about? Someone's been in here. That room was sealed for 30 years. His voice dropped. "No one gets in without tearing down the wall, and no one has." Margaret stared at him, fear sharpening into something colder, more rational. "Then you're suggesting the impossible." "I am suggesting," Weller replied carefully, "that the Holloway family wasn't as careful as it wanted the world to believe." He moved to the desk and examined the journal. The brass clasp remained locked, but faint smudges marred its surface. Fresh ones, fingerprints dragged across dust that had otherwise lain untouched since 1954. "Look here," Weller pointed. "Someone tried to open it recently. Someone desperate." Margaret felt a pressure behind her ribs. "Do you think it was Edward's journal? What would he have written that needed hiding?" "Perhaps the truth," Weller said. "He was planning something the night he vanished, something dangerous, something that would have made powerful people, your family included, very afraid." His tone carried no accusation, only weary certainty. Margaret backed away, needing space to breathe. Her gaze drifted around the room, lingering on small details. A cigarette butt in a porcelain tray, burned halfway. A glass of water evaporated to a thin ring. A rug pulled slightly askew, revealing a floorboard with a narrow fissure. She crouched, tracing the crack. "What's this?" Weller knelt beside her. A loose board. She pried it up with her fingernails until it broke free. Underneath lay a shallow cavity filled with photographs bundled by a disintegrating ribbon. The top image showed Edward standing in the garden, sunlight hitting him at an angle that made him look both fierce and fragile. Lila stood behind him, barely visible, yet close enough to tell the truth. More photos followed, shadows of private meetings, Edward walking with servants, Lila in a doorway, eyes wary, Edward's elder brother Thomas watching him with an expression that could only be described as contempt. "These are dangerous," Weller whispered. "Very dangerous." Margaret sifted through them, her pulse quickening. One photo stopped her cold. Edward sitting at his desk, this desk, writing furiously in the same journal now under her hand. Behind him, half concealed in darkness, stood a man with unmistakable posture, unmistakable authority. Her great-grandfather, Charles Holloway. Weller looked over her shoulder. He knew. The historian murmured. He knew about Edward and Lila, and he confronted him. Margaret felt a tremor course through her. But what happened after that? Weller didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "Would you like to see something your grandfather once told me, off the record?" He reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, yellowed with age. "I wasn't supposed to keep this," Weller said, "but I did because it frightened me." Margaret opened it carefully. The handwriting was elegant, distinct, old-world formal. A son who betrays his family must choose between loyalty and consequence. Edward understands this. Tonight, he will make his choice. The note was dated June 12th, 1954, the night Edward disappeared. Margaret's heart hammered. This sounds like a threat. It was. Weller said solemnly. One Charles Holloway was fully capable of acting on. Before Margaret could speak, a sudden thump sounded behind them, a sharp, muted impact from deeper within the house. Not above them, not below, from the servant wing. Weller straightened slowly, eyes darkening. "That," he whispered, "is where the truth always tries to return." The servant wing felt colder than the rest of the house, as if the very walls resented the intrusion. Margaret followed Dr. Weller through the dim corridor, each step echoing against plaster that had absorbed generations of whispered orders, hurried footsteps, and conversations that were never meant to reach Holloway ears. Here the hierarchy of the household had once lived in sharp relief. The powerful upstairs, the invisible downstairs, all functioning under a veneer of civility that now cracked with every passing moment. The thump they'd heard had come from the far end of the wing, near the staircase leading to the basement. The workers hadn't touched this part of the house yet, leaving the air thick with the scent of old wood and damp stone. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, fighting the chill creeping along her spine. Weller paused at the top of the staircase. "This place has always felt haunted," he said quietly. "Not by spirits, but by the weight of what people refuse to acknowledge." Margaret glanced down the steps. The darkness swallowed the light almost instantly. What exactly happened down there? Weller's expression turned grave. There were rumors that Charles Holloway held meetings in the basement. Private discussions with men who owed him favors, or who feared him. Land deals, debt arrangements, political promises. But there were other rumors too, ones involving threats, coercion, and certain residents of Lancaster who didn't have the privilege to refuse him. His voice lowered as he continued. Especially those who worked for him. Margaret understood the implication. The disquiet in her chest sharpened. "You're suggesting my great-grandfather may have harmed his own servants?" "I'm suggesting," Weller replied, "that the power dynamics of this house were never equal, and when Edward began aligning himself with people Charles saw as beneath him, the household became a battlefield." He began descending the stairs. Margaret hesitated but followed, her hand brushing the wall. The basement air was heavy, humid, metallic, almost sweet, in a way that made her stomach tighten. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting a honey-colored glow across crates and shelves lined with objects untouched for decades. Weller approached an old wooden table near the center of the room. Its surface bore scratches that looked almost ritualistic. Margaret swallowed. "What is that?" she asked. Weller traced the marks with a finger. This table was used for more than storage. Back then, it was where difficult conversations took place. Conversations about loyalty, about obedience. The words pressed on Margaret like stones. "And Edward?" she whispered. "Did he ever come down here?" Weller nodded. The night he disappeared, several neighbors reported seeing lights in the basement. They thought nothing of it at the time. The Holloway house was always active, even late. But one witness, a former farmhand who worked down the road, claimed he heard shouting. A man's voice, then another, then a scream. He paused. He wasn't sure if it was a man's or a woman's. Margaret's breath faltered. "A woman? Lila," Weller said. "She vanished the same night." Margaret gripped the edge of the table as nausea swelled. The pieces were aligning, painfully, inevitably. Weller continued. If Edward planned to expose his father or others, Lila might have been the key. She knew the family's secrets from within, and she knew what Edward intended. That kind of knowledge was dangerous in a place like this. Margaret's gaze shifted to a corner of the basement where a small door stood slightly ajar. A utility closet, perhaps. But the darkness behind it seemed deeper than the room itself. Compelled, she went to it and pushed the door open. Inside was a narrow space lined with shelves. On one shelf rested a small metal box, rusted but intact. She lifted it carefully and brought it into the light. Weller opened it with a slow exhale. Inside were letters, dozens of them, sealed envelopes with Edward's handwriting on each. Margaret selected the top one and unfolded it. The ink had faded, but the message struck like a blade. If anything happens to me tonight, know that I did not disappear willingly. They will try to erase Lila. They will try to erase us both. But truth has a way of surviving, even when sealed behind walls. Margaret's throat constricted. Weller looked at her with quiet gravity. Edward was planning to expose crimes far beyond his father's indiscretions, he said. There were businessmen, councilmen, even the sheriff at the time, deeply involved in transactions that would have destroyed them if revealed. Edward had evidence. Lila had witnessed the rest. Margaret pressed her hand against her brow, overwhelmed by the weight of her family's legacy. "So they silenced them?" she whispered. Weller didn't answer at first. Instead, he turned toward the staircase. "That's the question," he said, "and someone in this house may still know the answer." But before they could leave the basement, the bulb above them flickered once, twice, then died. In the sudden dark, something moved at the top of the stairs, a faint outline framed against the gray light from the hallway, watching, breathing, waiting. For a moment, Margaret could only hear her pulse pounding in her ears. The silhouette at the top of the stairs stood perfectly still, its posture unnervingly straight. Dr. Weller reached out, guiding her subtly behind him as he squinted through the dark. "Who's there?" he called. No answer, only the faint whisper of breath, brittle as winter wind. Weller stepped forward, but the figure retreated, slowly, silently, until it disappeared beyond the hallway's edge. The basement swallowed every trace of it, as though the darkness itself had lifted it away. Margaret forced her shaking hands to find the edge of the wall. "We need the light," she whispered. Weller struck a match, its flame trembling. They climbed the stairs cautiously, the house growing colder as they moved. By the time they reached the hallway, the figure was gone. But something else had changed. The door to the hidden room upstairs now stood open, wide open. No draft could do that. No mistake of the crew. Margaret felt herself pulled toward the staircase as if the house demanded her return, demanded that the truth finally be acknowledged. Weller followed her reluctantly, muttering to himself, "Whoever was here, whoever's been here, knows this house better than any of us." They reached the landing. The hidden room's air smelled faintly of cedar and something more troubling, something that reminded Margaret of disturbed soil. The journal lay on the floor, its brass clasp broken. Pages spilled outward like a wound. She dropped to her knees and carefully lifted the journal. The first page held Edward's handwriting, fluid, elegant, unmistakably his. June 12, 1954. "Tonight I confront my father. He believes fear is a tool, but fear rots anything it touches. Lila and I carry truth, and truth gives us leverage. Perhaps too much." Margaret flipped to the next entry. "Thomas warned me. He said Father would never allow me to expose what he built. He said Father had done worse to men he valued less." Another page. "Lila insists we leave tonight, but she has something Father wants, her testimony, her memory, her presence. She knows where the bodies are buried, in more ways than one." Margaret froze. "Bodies?" Weller lowered himself beside her. "Illegal burials," he murmured. "There were rumors of accidents on Holloway-owned land. Workers crushed, beaten, silenced. No investigations ever followed." The journal continued. "If I do not return by sunrise, then Father has chosen violence over reason. Lila will try to run. They cannot let her." Margaret's breath hitched. "So they killed them?" Weller shook his head slowly, thoughtfully. "Not necessarily, but they did something. Something deliberate." Suddenly, another loose floorboard caught Margaret's eye, one they hadn't noticed before. She pushed it aside, revealing a folded piece of fabric. When she lifted it, she realized it was a monogrammed handkerchief, embroidered with the Holloway crest. Dark stains marred the corner. Weller examined it. His face tightened. This belonged to Charles. Margaret had never felt a heavier weight in her chest. He hurt them. Weller didn't respond. Instead, he rose and moved toward the wardrobe in the corner of the room, a wardrobe she'd dismissed as ordinary. He tugged at its handle. Stuck. He pulled harder. It creaked open. Inside, behind coats and garments untouched for decades, was a narrow vertical panel of wood. Its edges were worn, scraped, used. A hidden passage. Weller inhaled sharply. This wasn't on any blueprint. Margaret stepped closer. "Where does it go?" "There's only one place it can go," he replied. "Down." He pushed the panel inward, revealing a descending chute, tight, suffocating, the kind used in old estates to move laundry or trash discreetly. but its interior bore scratch marks. Deep ones. Human ones. Margaret staggered back. "Oh God." Weller's voice was quiet, nearly reverent. "Edward and Lila didn't leave the house. They were taken, forced, perhaps bound. And this was how they were moved." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. The room seemed to tilt. "Where does it end?" Weller swallowed. "Most likely, the basement." The realization landed like a stone. But before they could descend again, a faint sound rose from below. Soft, rhythmic, almost a whisper. Not footsteps, not breathing. A voice. A woman's voice. Just one word carried upward in a trembling echo. "Edward." The room grew impossibly still. Weller looked at Margaret, his expression shifting. Not fear, but a solemn recognition that the house had begun revealing its truth in its own time, in its own way. "Someone," he murmured, "has waited 30 years to be heard." And the voice, fragile, mournful, drifted upward again. If this story gripped you as much as the discovery did back in 1984, make sure to leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video with anyone who loves dark American history buried behind walls and silence. Your support helps uncover more hidden stories like this one.